then going to focus on three key mega trends that I think are driving the industry. And they are premiumization, they are craft, and that's in inverted commas for a good reason, and hitting the sweet spot, which is this drift towards sweeter, easier to drink beverages. I'm then going to very briefly look at malt beverages. Obviously they're not beer, but they're very, very germane to most of the people in this room, certainly those involved in the malt industry. And finally, I'm going to wrap up with some forecasts and conclusions. You're seeing increasingly consumers looking for more value. Effectively, one of the drivers of premiumization is exactly the same as the driver for discount or value beer. It's a value proposition. People want more for the money they're spending. And if we look globally in beer, we see it's premium and super premium that's actually driving the wider beer market. On the one hand, in developed markets, you've got all the growth being driven by specialty brands. You also have a counter trend of very strong growth from these big international premium lagers. So what's effectively getting squeezed are the big national lager brands. They're not premium, they're not international, that's what's getting squeezed. And these are particularly strong in developing markets, the growth of international brands. And if you look at these three examples, you can see in Budweiser, the main driver has been China. For Corona, it's been the USA. And for Heineken, it's been Africa. Obviously, these brands are growing across all markets, but these are the real growth drivers for those three examples. Premium international lagers will continue to benefit major global brewers. Obviously, they're built upon one or two very strong flagship brands, and especially those with exposure to emerging and developing markets. And the example of Heineken I gave there really backs that up. However, you need to be careful. Premiumization through brand extensions and new product launches can dilute your core proposition. So you do need to be aware. And specialty beers are taking share from lager. Now, depending on where you are, that's a good or a bad thing. So if we look at North America, this is really the cradle of true craft beer. You see that the total beer volume is very, very flat. Per capita consumption is very high. Their growth rate, historical growth rate was around 1%, a 1% decline, and that's pretty much the same in the past year. But if you look at the individual segments, and you can see really huge differences in growth. So here, light beer was what had driven the US beer market for years and years, pretty much since the 80s onwards. It was light beer that was driving the category. And in recent years, you can see it's craft, it's specialities, to a lesser degree it's imports, and although it's not actually beer, it's also cider. So we look at volume by selected beer segments. So over here, this little green bar here was craft in 2003. 10 years later, you can see massive growth. And the fragmentation, it's almost a given in most markets, the share of the leading brands is consolidating, it's getting bigger. In the US, it's actually going the other way. So in 2003, top 10 brands had 75% of the market. By 2013, that had fallen to 71%. So you've got a fragmentation of brands. What does constitute a craft beer? Is it limited production? Is it batch production? Is it something that's sold on a brewer's premises, like a brew pub? Is it local or nationwide distribution? Is it independent? Can it be a subsidiary of a larger brewer? And coming back to the poor old consumer again, 4 in 10 of them say they don't know what a craft beer is. I'm surprised it's only 4 in 10, to be honest. Only 3 in 10 beer drinkers say they're knowledgeable about craft beer, and only 3 in 10 say they know the difference between a real ale and a craft beer, if indeed there is one. So despite its very high profile, craft beer is almost by definition, I mean, it's self-defining. If it has to be small, it's never going to be that large. There's little or no consensus as to what constitutes craft beer, and that's across consumers, producers, and retailers. The craft boom is probably unsustainable in its current growth. But I believe many of those underlying drivers, as I say, are part of a bigger change. So I think there will continue to be interest in specialty beers, in craft-style beers. Whether they call them craft beers, whether you see the same degree of publicity, I think is more debatable. And I think where the larger brewers have succeeded is in actually creating craft units within a much larger organisation. And two examples would be Carlsberg with the Jakobsen Mini Brewery and Molson Coors Sandlot Brewery in Denver. So that's where Blue Moon was developed. And Blue Moon is another one of these examples. Is it a craft beer or isn't it a craft beer? Purists will tell you it's not. Molson Coors certainly would tell you it probably is. Now moving on to the sweet spot. So this move towards sweeter drinks, it's manifested in a whole range of ways that all meet the same consumer needs. So there's a certain consumer need state for something that is sweet, easy to drink, relatively low in alcohol, and probably comes in a 33 centilitre bottle. So we define two categories. We define beer mixes, that's beer mixed with a soft drink, usually lemonade or cola. And this would be the Panache, the Radlers, the Beer Mix Getranker in Germany. And then we have flavoured beers, and these are full-strength beers with flavour. And this is where all the Belgian fruit beers would sit. This is where Desperados sits. It's where SAB Miller's Reds sits. And if you look at flavoured beers, it's still niche, but it's got very strong growth in North America and in Western Europe. And again, if you remember, the overall market is declining. These brands actually growing relatively fast. And many of the companies obviously are now investing heavily in this category. Is it the next big thing? So one of the things you're seeing is cider now. So you've got Carlsberg with Somersby, you've got AB InBev, both with Stella Cidra in the UK, and in America they've gone for a brand extension of their Michelob brand, so taking that into the cider category. Traditionally, beer mixes has been a West European phenomenon, but the recent growth from Eastern Europe has been phenomenal, despite an overall decline in the beer market. So if we look at Eastern Europe there, this was the Eastern Europe share of the beer mix market in 2010. This was Eastern Europe's share in 2013. So though the underlying need for sweet, easy-to-drink alcohol seems likely to continue, there's no guarantee that Radlers and flavoured ciders will be able to maintain volume. As I said, consumers are very, very fickle. And they will move on to the next product that happens to meet that particular need state. They do offer an opportunity to recruit female consumers, but you do need to be very, very careful about making assumptions about female consumers. And the current demonisation of sugar could see that pendulum swing back again, as you're going to start seeing a generation, 10 years' time, I would argue, that actually doesn't have such a sweet taste profile because they haven't been allowed to have Pepsi and cola and very, very sweet drinks as children. The other almost counter trend to this is that the booming craft beers, most of which have very, very high bitterness levels. So again, it's part of this fragmentation of consumers. There's probably one set of consumers that are drinking these sweeter products and another set that are drinking the craft beers. So very quickly moving on to malt beverages. So the real strength of these brands, they allow brewers to get into these new market, but it uses pretty much the same skills, the same equipment, and a lot of the same raw materials. Very strong growth of the clear malts in the Middle East will more than compensate for the slowdown in Latin America and the Caribbean. All leading brewing groups have an interest in the category, and as I say, Coca-Cola already a major player through its stake in Ojan. And as we looked on there are some areas of the world where these products don't really exist yet, which is a huge opportunity, and that would be Asia, Europe, and North America outside of the currently very small ethnic market. So to round up, what do we think is going to happen in the future? I'm fighting the temptation to say not a lot. We think 2% growth is the new normal. And I think that's probably going to be borne out. It's certainly what looks like is happening last year, and I think that's going to happen going forward. We will see growth, but it's going to be much lower than before the financial crisis. That divergence between emerging markets and developed markets is just going to continue and get wider. China will continue to grow, but the growth is slowing. And I know just looking at their overall GDP figures, I think they were saying, oh dear, we've gone down to 5%. And most people in the West would bite your hand off of 5% growth, but in China, it's a calamity. We think Africa is going to be the region to watch. And key individual markets to watch, we think, will be Colombia, Vietnam, Nigeria, and India. And of course, India is always a very, very complex and very difficult market. Arguably, it's not a market, it's 50 different markets, because every state tends to have its own tariff barriers, taxation system, distribution regulations. So it's a very difficult market, but the sheer number of consumers and the very, very large number of affluent middle-class consumers mean that it's a real prize. And so I was really pleased to see that we were in agreement with the first speaker yet again. Consolidation slows. We don't think we've reached the end game yet, but I would totally agree with Eric. I don't think we're going to see any mega mergers. I think the only people who are really pushing that are probably the financial institutions. Premium beer, especially premium international premium lager, is driving growth. Craft beer is still a hot topic, but there's very little consensus over how to define it. Radler volumes have held up after the initial sort of tsunami of Radler launches. They've held up, but growth is plateauing. So we're not seeing that growth continuing, but we haven't seen the market fall off a cliff either. And malt beverages could provide real opportunities for brewers.